Hello, I'm a fraudster, and I'm going to scare the living daylights out of more than 1 in 5 of you. Your online password is...
Adding numbers, capitals, and symbols makes your password stronger.
Provost, colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Imperial College London. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, and very warm welcome to those joining us remotely this morning. On behalf of the Institute of Global Health Innovation, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Tony Blair back to Imperial College to give an important speech on the future of Britain, which could not be more timely. Having known and have had the honor of working with Tony for many years, I'll of course like to take this opportunity to congratulate him on his recent honor from Her Majesty the Queen. The Knighthood is not only a deserved recognition for all he has done for our country, but as he himself has noted, a tribute to the transformational government that he led. I'm also delighted that we are joined by Rachel Sylvester, columnist and interviewer for The Times. After Tony's speech, Rachel will host an in-conversation session and then moderate a question and answer session with the audience. I first met Tony in early 2000s, when under his government I was asked to join the National Modernisation Board. This was one of the many efforts being mobilized as part of the NHS plan to help tackle the long waiting lists and ensure the NHS was fit for purpose. It was an unprecedented response to a public and staff dissatisfaction that saw billions poured into the NHS. As a national advisor for surgery at the time, it was also exciting and refreshing to see how innovation in the NHS was being supported and also incentivized. The NHS now faces not dissimilar challenges as we unravel the wider impact of the pandemic in relation to backlogs, late disease presentations, and the pressures of social care. Technology and innovation will provide the critical tools in delivering the changes needed within the constraints we all inevitably face in terms of spending and tax burden. As we will hear now from Tony, Britain is at the inflection point and faces an unprecedented challenges ranging from trading relationships post-Brexit, the technology revolution changing both the economy and society, to climate emergency. It is therefore critical that we plan strategically to address any potential changes needed for our country to thrive over the course of the coming decade. Tony, we are honored that you have chosen to deliver this speech at Imperial, as addressing these pressing challenges resonates strongly with us as we seek to push the frontiers in science and remain at the forefront of pioneering research, driving innovation, and delivering world-class education. Imperial is internationally recognized, and our ambition remains to deliver transformative impact for societal benefit on a global scale. We are very excited to hear your talk, which I have no doubt will act as a call to action in both enhancing our perspective and heightening our resolve to redouble the efforts to overcome the many significant obstacles that lie ahead. Please join me in welcoming Tony Blair to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see people here. As a result of, obviously, still the COVID restrictions, it's a smaller group of people than we otherwise would have assembled, but thank you so much for coming. I'm really honored that you have, and Ara is one of the people I respect most in public life. He's a thinker who's also a practitioner, and a practitioner who's also a leader. It's a pretty rare combination. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have your introduction. And thank you, Ara, for the kind welcome. And thank you also to the Institute of Global Health Innovation for hosting today's event. I can't think of any better place to speak with you about the future of Britain, and an institution like Imperial College, which is a tremendous global leader in science, engineering, medicine, and business. The achievements of Imperial researchers are enormous and are not just reserved for the 14 Nobel Prize winners, from the discovery of penicillin to the development of holography to the invention of fiber optics and to groundbreaking engineering projects like the Maglev Railway. And of course, Imperial has played an important role in the response to the COVID pandemic, most notably the REACT study led by Ara and a talented team here at Imperial. The REACT program has become one of the world's biggest studies of community COVID, the testing of it particularly, and has been instrumental in tracking the progress of the epidemic here in this country. But I know also that this study has been of invaluable and great help as a source of data for policymakers all over the world, and we should be immensely grateful to them. So, to turn to the speech, which is the future of Britain in an era of what I've called the three revolutions. And I start by saying there's a gaping hole in the governing of Britain where new ideas should be. We're living through three revolutionary changes simultaneously and are ill-prepared for any of them. Each of them would require major changes in the way we work as a nation. All of them together pose a challenge which is unprecedented in recent history. The changes are Brexit, the technology revolution, and a climate ambition which foresees a unique transition to being carbon neutral in the power sector in just over a decade, and the whole country in 25 years. COVID-19 has in some senses masked the scale of the challenge because it has been its own extraordinary crisis. But as it recedes, or at least becomes managed, the following will become starkly clear. By end 2022, we were the highest tax burden and the largest spending by the state since the post-war period. Our debt will be higher than at any time in the last half century, and our sustainable growth rates in the next years will be around 1.7%, nowhere near those of the first part of this century, and woefully inadequate to pay for the services we expect. For the average household, taxes will rise by around £370 per year, energy prices by £600. They will be asked to swap gas boilers for heat pumps and their conventional fuel cars for electric vehicles. The costs of basic foodstuffs are going up, and general inflation will cause rises in interest rates. Business will see the biggest shift and uplift in corporation tax since the 1970s, whilst investment is 12% below pre-Brexit amounts. Our productivity levels, the real test of an economy's strength and the key to real wage rises, are stagnating. Now, we retain significant strengths. Our universities, our leading-edge technology, particularly in areas like the life sciences, which post-COVID is a huge asset, and now in climate technologies, like renewables. We've got the City of London as a global financial centre still. Creative industries, our language, our culture, historic and present connectivity to so much of the world. There is no cause, therefore, for pessimism, but there is an urgent need for realism in the face of these revolutions. Without a radical shift in policy, we face a steady, inexorable compound decline similar to the 1960s and 1970s. It could be several years before we realize this, but with our present course, we're relegating ourselves to a league which is poorer, less prosperous, and less powerful. I hesitate when I hear the government slogan, levelling up. Other than a desire to give opportunity to those without it, which obviously is hard to disagree with, the slogan risks misdirecting the framing of the country's problem. We face a national challenge, all of the country, not simply the areas left behind. So to the revolutions. Brexit is a word most of us want to forget. Understandably, it was a deeply divisive period. It was a divided time, and indeed it's done. The debate about its wisdom is over. But it was a decision of consequence, and the consequence we cannot ignore, however much we may want to. According to the government's forecast on current policy, we will suffer a long-term 4% drop in GDP. The preparations as a result of exiting the single market have cost the government directly over £4 billion, and probably much, much more to the private sector. Brexit uncertainty is one of the top 3 concerns of 40% of British business. And leave aside Northern Ireland, we don't yet have deals on the city, financial services, or any part of the services sector. There are tariff borders on industrial goods, and we face a situation where we're shut out of Europe when Europe is taking decisions across a range of issues which deeply affect us. We can alter our political and legal relationship with Europe, but we cannot change our interests or our geography. The government doesn't have a post-Brexit regulatory strategy, and it is letting passive divergence from the EU exacerbate costs for businesses for no purpose, deepening an already substantial economic hit from Brexit itself. We need to decide what our new trade relations with Europe should be, where we can easily align with European regulation and where, practically, we want to depart from it, and have a whole area where we're intending to deepen our European relationship for the future in areas like defense, energy, and the environment. Above all, we need to make our economy highly competitive, attract world-class talent, and make our independence from the EU a platform for economic growth. But it needs a plan into which hard work and thought has gone, policy detail, strategic analysis, and at present there isn't one. The technology revolution is the most important and most impactful of the three revolutions. But talk to many policymakers about tech, and to be fair, this is not a purely British phenomenon, and they're much more comfortable talking about regulating Facebook than setting out the opportunities, for example, of education technology to change the way we teach and learn, or how the National Health Service should be completely rethought in how it's structured and paid for. Yet over the coming decade, this revolution will disrupt virtually every part of our lives, including our working lives. Advances in artificial intelligence will be dramatic. Whole sectors of the economy, both services and manufacturing, will feel the impact. As many as 9 million jobs could be automated, though of course new jobs will also be created. It's a revolution in the labour market. Here the government does have a plan of sorts, but measure the government's plan against the scale of the change, and it is immediately apparent how short it is from what is necessary. Net zero by 2050. It's the right commitment with interim stretching targets in power, transport, and construction for 2035. But just think of what these correct but vastly ambitious climate commitments mean. In little over 10 years, we will have to double electricity supply, replace the present heating systems in 10 million homes, turn 20 million fossil fuel cars into scrap and replace them with electric vehicles, and create renewables at 4 times the present rate. And all whilst losing the revenue which comes from fuel duty, which will amount to an annual shortfall of some £20 billion by 2035. There is absolutely no way this can be done without, amongst other things, major changes in planning laws, investment in new nuclear capacity, using gas as a transitional fuel, reform of electricity markets, and a credible strategy for switching our homes to low-carbon heating. But show me the plan to do this. The point is, these triple revolutions necessitate a vast reordering of government's priorities, its policies, its personnel, how it's structured. It requires a level of coherence so that, for example, what we do on taxation does not cut across what we do to stay competitive. What we want to do on local devolution doesn't run counter to what we must do on planning law. And it needs our political debate to change radically. The paradox of 21st century politics is at the very time when 20th century ideology of left versus right has never been less relevant, our main political parties became bedeviled by it. The Conservative Party deserted their traditional role as high priests of pragmatic change and turned Thatcherism into a cult. The Labour Party went through the catastrophe of the Corbyn era, from which, under Keir Starmer's determined leadership, it is thankfully emerging with renewed vigour, a talented front bench, as Rachel Reeves shows again today, and her speech underlines, and the Labour Party has recovered a healthy desire to erase the memory of 4 successive defeats. It could provide the plan the country needs. As Keir himself acknowledges, This is indeed the Labour Party challenge for 2022. However, for years, policy for both parties, in the sense of a relentless search for the right answer, which, as I discovered in government, is ultimately all that matters, that was abandoned. Politics became all about politics, not about ideas. I understand completely the rage against what happened in Downing Street during lockdown and how the country feels. And maybe Boris Johnson goes and maybe he doesn't. But the real problem for Britain is the absence of a government plan for Britain's future. The NHS will soon eat up over 40% of day-to-day spending on public services. At least when we put health spending up to the European average in the early years of this century, we accompanied it by far-reaching reforms, which took NHS satisfaction levels to the highest they'd ever been. But today, though the staff continue to perform miracles, the service, especially post-COVID, is too often unacceptably poor. There are those within the NHS leading the way on reform, using technology to transform the service, thinking imaginatively about the future. We need to empower them. Through advances in medical science, the use of data, making systems properly interoperable, and artificial intelligence, we can transform the patient experience and reduce cost. And Lord Darzi himself has estimated that the NHS could save £12.5 billion by use of AI in eliminating routine and administrative tasks alone. But all of this requires organising together with major workforce reform. The point is, we can't go on as we are, even in an area as politically delicate as the NHS. And you can make this case across the whole of public policy. We need to apply technology to areas like crime and immigration, where the only sensible way of preventing illegal immigration is a system of digital identity. We need to shift tax from labour and capital, especially post-Brexit, find other sources of revenue so that our tax system is not colliding with our competitiveness, and to rethink pensions for the next generation, where apart from the burgeoning costs, the circumstances of retirement will be completely different in the next generation from today. Fuel duty will probably have to be replaced by some form of road pricing. And the point is, this list is not exhaustive, but not a single thing we need to do to turn our fortunes around will come without political pain. And our politics show few, if any, signs of preparedness to tolerate that pain. Just remember the Thatcher economic reforms caused huge public discontent. At times, by the way, the Tories were third in the polls. The country was bitterly divided. Likewise, under New Labour, the changes to public services, to law and order, the redistribution of wealth, reforms like the minimum wage, they were all heavily contested at the time. And that was when the economy was strong. Meeting the challenge of these three revolutions is infinitely more difficult than any of that, and at a time when the economy is still recovering from COVID. It means reorganization of a fundamental nature in the way that government works, bringing in the brightest and best innovators from outside government, and a mobilization of talent and resource we're nowhere near achieving. And I don't think it can be done unless politicians work across traditional party lines to create a plan that is sustainable over at least a decade. Because reforms as far-reaching and difficult as these require consistency of policy over time, even through a change of government. So, my institute, over these next months, we'll set out in a series of papers and seminars with a global as well as national perspective, at least the principles of this new policy agenda. Then the Britain Project, it's a group working across party lines, though headed by a Liberal Democrat, Monica Harding. It will organise a conference in May. And we want this conference to be an opportunity for people to come together and set out a broad direction for the future of Britain. Those participating should leave politics and ideology at the door. Our task is practical understanding of how the world is changing and what that means for what works to make our country stronger, fairer, and more prosperous. The choices will be hard. Old ways, old interests, old thinking don't go gently. But neither should a country, especially one with such a proud history as ours, slip gently into a lower league without a strenuous effort, at least, to prevent it. Yet without a radical change in the governing of the country and its politics, this is where we're headed. And this is the debate, in my view, that Britain needs. Thank you.
Thank you, that's fascinating. And I want to come on to the substance of the speech in a moment, but it's hard to really think about the future of Britain without thinking about the future of the Prime Minister. So I did want to ask you, you said maybe Boris Johnson goes, maybe he doesn't. What do you think, and what do you think about that culture that was in place in Downing Street?
Yeah. So what I think is that, I failed on that, is that the reason I chose those words in the way that I did was not to get into that question, because I think it's not for me, and there are plenty of people who will do it and comment on it. And, you know, obviously things were very different in my day in the way that the government in Downing Street was run. But I do honestly believe, and it's the reason for doing the speech today, is to say, whatever happens to him, and I can't affect that, and that's a matter for whatever this inquiry says and then the reaction of the Conservative Party, to be blunt about it, really, more than anyone else. The problem is the absence of a plan. I mean, I always used to say to people, and do say to the different leaders I work with around the world today, the most important thing in politics is to be the man or woman with the plan. If you're the person with the plan, you create an agenda. And when you're going through tough times, and I obviously went through many as Prime Minister, if people see a direction and they know there's a plan and you're working to it, that sustains you through the difficult times. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of the latest opinion poll. So that's why I've decided to concentrate on this.
Do you have a view about whether or not...
Bottle of water, actually. Open. Sorry, the thing just goes round and round. Oh.
Do you have a view about whether there needs to be more sort of independent oversight of Prime Ministers, whether Lord Geit should have more of the ability to launch his own inquiries, for example, the Standards Commissioner?
That falls into the category of a question where if I was still Prime Minister, I would almost certainly say no. No, I'm not sure. I don't think so, really, because I think in the end, you know, the ultimate discipline and accountability is to Parliament and to the people.
And do you have a view about who would be the most dangerous leader to take over for Labour? If you were Labour leader, who would you fear most? And if, you know, it's a danger for if Rishi Sunak takes over, Keir Starmer's competence looks slightly less relevant.
Well, again, to be not to try and, well, to try and dodge it, but dodge it in a what I think is the right way. We should fear any leader who does have a plan. But the best thing is for Labour, and that's why part of the reason why I set out what I did today is to say, actually, Labour should have this plan. And I think that Keir has done a really good job in these last months. I think we turned a corner at the conference. I think that you know, the front bench is a much revived, more vigorous and capable group of people. And, you know, that Rachel Reeves' speech today is also, I think, fully consistent with the themes I'm doing. But the hard thing is to set out, well, what does that actually mean in policy terms? And that's the challenge. But for Labour, I think it's got an enormous opportunity, but it needs a policy agenda the country meets that requirement.
So what do you think explains this policy vacuum? Because I'm chairing an education commission for the Times, and we've been taking evidence from scientists, business leaders, former politicians like you, actors, artists, all kinds of people. Lots of people are buzzing with ideas, but the current political class, there is absolutely nothing. Why is that? Is it to do with the fact that Brexit made politics into sort of culture war, or is it something deeper, that there's a kind of post-imperial complacency? What's your explanation for the cause of this?
I think the causes are many. I mean, certainly over the last few years, we had Brexit and then a whole set of several years of debate. But I don't think that really explains it fully. And I think you can see very similar things in America as well. And what has happened is that I think social media is the revolutionary phenomenon in this. I really do believe it changes the whole nature of the political debate. And it means that politicians, and this is the challenge for Western democracy today, is how do you prove that you're effective? See, the things that I'm talking about today, they can't work unless you do them over a long term. When I talk to leaders nowadays, I say to them, if you want to change a country, 10 years is your minimum, and preferably 20. But since you're not going to be around for 20, you need a period of government which goes through changes of government that's relatively stable. I mean, if you look at my government and the Thatcher government, and there are a lot of people in the Labour Party who didn't like and still don't like me putting it in this way, but the truth is, we came into power determined to repair the public realm, to make the country fairer, but not to displace some of the key industrial and indeed trade union reforms that the Thatcher government made. That meant that for about 30 years you had a relative consistency of policy. But that's enormously beneficial to a country because people know where they are and they can plan ahead and so on. It's this bouncing around that is problematic, especially if it's not really to do with long-term thinking, but to do with short-term politics. So I don't know, it's a problem in Western politics as a whole. My hope, though, is that COVID has reawakened in the public the knowledge that in the end governing is a serious task that requires, you know, hard thought, analysis, detail, grip, because in the end, they will be the losers if that long-term thinking isn't there. And I think there are some signs from the rest of Europe that things are moving in that direction. I mean, you wouldn't have said this about 10 or 15 years ago, certainly not when I was in office, but Italy looks reasonably stable today as a country making significant change. Now, why is that? It's because its politics has come to a realization, I think COVID has helped this, that the most important thing is to do what's necessary and that it's not really an ideological question.
But do you think the voters are willing to do all the unpopular things that are going to be necessary? So we're basically going to have much less fun, aren't we? Less driving, less flying, less eating of meat, less having a nice time. That's an incredibly difficult message for a politician to give. And how do you articulate that?
Well, actually, I think we can be better off and happier and have more fun. But the process of change is the hard thing. So, you know, you can, for example, if you take technology, which is the big revolution going on, really, it's the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution. You look at how you can apply it in healthcare. You can make people better able to look after their own conditions. You can ensure that people have easier access to services, better interaction with their health professionals. I mean, I think technology's got a vastly liberating aspect to it. And part of the trouble with the technology debate, as I say, is if you go virtually anywhere in the world, you go and talk to a group of MPs anywhere, and they'll talk to you all day about Facebook, you know, and regulating it. But actually, we should be thinking, well, I mean, you actually did a really interesting thing, I think, a few weeks back on Estonia and schools and education technology. That's what we should be doing. So I don't think it's painful because it's change. It's not painful because at the end of it, you'll be in more pain. You know?
But you have to also have a different attitude to data and privacy, because I think, you know, just on the education sphere, in China, they were trialing a thing where they had the children wearing headbands so they could see how much they were concentrating. And there's all kinds of technological revolutions that you could use to, but that basically involves us giving up masses of data for AI to work properly. And I noticed you talked about the sort of biometric ID cards for. Does there need to be a sort of shift in our attitude to ourselves and privacy and civil liberties?
I don't think a fundamental one. I mean, look, it all depends. I mean, what you described in China, well, it wouldn't have suited me as a kid, I'll tell you that.
Even they gave it up in China, actually, because the parents protested.
Right. So you need discernment. I mean, the whole point about technology is value-free, but the use to which you put it, obviously, you apply your values to it. And this is why I don't find it as difficult as other people do. For biometric ID, countries around the world will move to this because it enables the citizen. Some countries, India, for example, has used it to cut out a lot of corruption. If you're able to use your biometric ID to do lots of interaction with government that you can do online without a big problem or hassle, it's a good thing. And the amount of information the government will have on you, this is why the privacy argument to me is sort of weird. I mean, it's much less than your local supermarket's got. So I don't, you know, but it needs to be explained to people. And that's a classic example, by the way, of how ideology gets in the way. And this is the problem, because the truth is there's a part of the Conservative Party that have, for whatever reason, taken this up as a civil liberties issue, a part of the left that also does that, when really it's just about using technology to enable you to do things more easily. And on immigration, you know, the problem in immigration is very, very simple. It's the numbers of people who are here without a legal right to be here. And that can be anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million people at a time, right? So you need to work that out. I mean, let me give you a really good example about what I mean with the collision of and the absence of strategy when you're just looking at short-term politics. And I don't think this decision is about to be taken very soon in the next couple of days. But this is a question of whether we agree that we will do this big investment with France in order to have greater interconnectivity in our electricity systems. Because at the moment we get roughly 5% of our electricity through this interconnecting system. Now, one of the government ministers was out the other day saying, no, we shouldn't do this because, you know, the French are being very difficult and, you know, they'll use it as a bargaining chip and so on and so forth. But, you know, if you've got a strategic plan for the country's future, which includes a plan for Europe and our relationship, which includes a plan for energy, it's absolutely nuts not to do this connector. It's a big investment. It's going to mean that you've got actually greater security of supply because you've got different sources. Sometimes we will be transferring renewable energy to France. They'll be transferring baseload nuclear power to us. It's a sensible thing. And yet I just know and I can sense from the way the argument's being run that it's all going to be through the prism of Brexit and, you know, are we standing up to Europe, exercising our freedom, when it should be a practical question.
So on ideology, I was interested that Lib Dem is going to be running the project. What do you see as the future of cooperation between the sort of centre-left parties? Do you think there should be deals or some kind of progressive alliance at an election? What should it mean should there be pacts or something more informal?
I think the reality is probably it would always be something more informal, a bit more like I, in a sense, had with Paddy Ashdown in 1997. But I don't think, and this is what I say to anyone in the Labour Party who asks me, don't treat this as a matter of arithmetic, right? You've got to have a programme. This is the importance of going back to policy. You've got to have a programme that you're both agreed on. Because if you don't have a programme that you're agreed on, don't think that you can say, well, Labour's got 35%, the Lib Dems have got 10%, and the Greens have got 6%, you put them all together. Because it doesn't work like that. And the truth is, the Lib Dems will attract a lot of support, as you can see from the by-elections, from soft Tories. If Labour's got a programme that can appeal to soft Tories, that's great. If Labour's got a programme that puts them off, face them with a real general election and they'll go back to the Tories. And of course, that is what happened in 2019. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people I met who said, yeah, no, I agree with you about Brexit. Yeah, no, I agree with you about the government, but no, Jeremy Corbyn is too much of a threat. Sorry, got to go Tory. So, you know, that's why the Lib Dems appeared to be doing really well until they got into an election. So my only statement here is just to counsel caution. In the end, unless it's clear you don't have to agree every detail, but you know there's not a fundamental difference between what the parties are trying to do, it won't work, even if whether it's formal or informal.
And what about Scotland? I was interested you didn't mention the union in the speech. Do you think the United Kingdom will still be together in 10 years? And what should Labour's approach be to the SNP? Should there be some kind of deal there? It's going to be very hard for Keir Starmer to get to Downing Street without Scottish support. Without Scottish support, yeah, but that doesn't mean to say the SNP, and I certainly don't favour doing a pact with them. I think that would be disastrous for Labour. No, Labour's way back in Scotland is to create, again, a strong agenda. It's got much better leadership today. I mean, Anas is extremely good, a very capable guy. But, you know, what you've got to do is you've got to rally support for, again, a programme that's definably different for Scottish government. And that's what will pull people in behind you and recover the party's credibility. But for years, the Labour Party's not done that. Now it's got the chance to do that. I think the UK will stay together, but I'm more worried about Northern Ireland in the short term than about Scotland. Okay. I'm going to open up to questions now. Lord Darcy, would you like to start?
Thank you. Tony, an inspirational talk as always. It reminds me of the old days. I'm going to be a little bit more specific. You're very generous, talked about REACT. In actual fact, many of my distinguished colleagues behind who really are the people who led REACT. And so I think the UK did a reasonable job against a threat. No question about that. And I forget about the political leadership and the policy leadership side of this. But how do you think we should be prepared in the future for a future pandemic? These threats are always around the corner. And these threats were in your time as a Prime Minister. In actual fact, we did have a threat of a pandemic on the transition between you and Gordon. So and the Institute, by the way, has been amazing in terms of the contributions during the pandemic. So what are the things we should be prepared for in the future against such threats, which I think aligns itself with climate change?
Yeah, so it's a very good point. I think there are two aspects to this. One for the country, for Britain, and the other more generally in terms of pandemic preparation. So we have a huge opportunity in Britain because of our leadership in life sciences. And, you know, my institute put forward a paper to government last year, and we're doing some more work on it now, about how you might establish a global pandemic preparedness centre here in the UK, be a public-private partnership. You bring the best in from around the world, very similar to some of the things you're trying to do at Imperial, but even on an augmented scale. And we should definitely do that, in my view. Now, at the moment, what we're doing is doing certain things through the Health Security Agency and Public Health England and all the rest of it. But I'm envisaging something which becomes the world centre for pandemic preparation. And that would involve things like, you know, being able to do the genomic sequencing, which, again, Britain is potentially a leader in. The development of vaccines and antivirals and biologics and all the rest of it. The ability to give really good health advice in a timely and clear way, not supplanting the WHO, but just realizing the limitations that are in it. And I think if we did that in the UK, we would both be able to prepare ourselves better for the future, because from all the people I talk to around the world, it looks like these pandemics are going to be regular occurrences. But the other thing is, I mean, you know much better than me, Ira, but life sciences itself has come on enormously during the course of the pandemic. So the whole mRNA technology obviously is extremely important, but I mean, I can see a situation where we have adult vaccination programs going across the world with a whole new set of vaccines for treatments. And this is, you know, if you want a role for Britain in the world, this would be a fantastic one to take up. So I've spoken to the government about it. I actually spoke to the Prime Minister about it. I think it's a huge thing for Britain to do. But again, this needs people in government to sit down and say, okay, we're actually going to do this. Because you can do it. The G7 has a committee that's kind of looking at some of the aspects of this, and you've got Gavi and CEPI and all these, and COVAT and all these international bodies. But someone somewhere has got to pull it all together and put it in one place, because otherwise it's never going to really be effective. And we've got a great opportunity to do it.
Is Sky News here?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I know, Sir Tony, you were keen not to talk about Boris, but we're going to give it another go. Quite broadly detailed, perhaps. If, in your view, a Prime Minister misleads the British people, should he resign? And secondly, in your view, has the moment of maximum danger for Boris Johnson now passed, and do you think rather perhaps Keir Starmer let him wriggle off the hook a little bit on during PMQs yesterday?
You know, I understand why you have to ask it, and I just want you to understand why there's thousands of people who are commenting on all of that. And the whole purpose of my speech today is not to get drawn into it. The thing that I want to say, because I think this is, at this moment in time, what is important is that someone says to the country, yes, there's a perfectly legitimate row about what was happening in Downing Street during the lockdown. It's perfectly right that people are enraged by it. It's perfectly right there's a lot of attention to it. But ultimately, what affects the country's prosperity, its power in the world, the living standards of its people, will be whether we have a plan for Britain's future in the face of the vast change that's coming down the track at us. And my worry with all of this, I think it's completely right that the debate takes place, is that we lose what is ultimately the single most important thing, which is the plan for the future. And that's what I want to concentrate on. And of course, but the moment I go into this, how long have I been doing this for? The moment I go into it, I'm going to get to it. Just forgive me. That's a question to the Leader of the Opposition. I'm sure he will give you a good interview on it.
Yes, at the back.
Hello, my name is Hutan Ashrafian. I work at IGHI and the US biotech firm Flagship Pioneering. Sir Tony, thank you for a great talk. And you very eloquently laid out the future for a digital revolution and a biotech revolution. To do that, we need to engage with the end users, who are the public, and there needs to be a fundamental issue of digital literacy across the country, not only in the young, but also across all demographics. How do you see the governance and the incentive structure working to take everyone up to speed, to take UK PLC to UK.com to UK.ai?
Yeah, so it's, again, a very good question. So if I was back in government today, I would be reorganizing the way government works. And that's what I meant by saying you need new structures, new personnel, you need to bring in different people. The system as a system, it's not that it's, I mean, the British system is in many ways one of the best in the world, but it's just that when you're going through this period of revolutionary change, it's not in the skill set of the people presently in government. And there's no point in getting a civil servant and pulling them out of one place and say, well, go and work on an AI, strategy. They're not, it's with the best will in the world, they're not going to be able to do it. So I think it needs a reshaping of government so that you're bringing people in from the outside and they're in positions of real authority. They're going out and with a plan to increase that digital understanding in the country, explaining what it means, bringing it into the schools, bringing it into part of the conversation we're having as a country, and getting people familiar with the fact that these changes are going to take place. And that's, again, it doesn't happen unless you have a plan for it. So, you know, the tech revolution, when you look at the implications of it, it is absolutely enormous in every walk of life. But our health service debate in Britain is still basically around who's going to spend more money, right? Our education debate is, I don't know what it is really, but it's not really any longer about reform. And yet, I think education is an area where I will be teaching different things in schools in different ways. I think probably the whole concept of the exam system is due a complete overhaul. I think you need to rethink all of this. So the way of doing it is you've got to get people in positions of authority who are going to be able to go out and explain this to people, have a debate in the country about it. And this is where we're starting from a long way behind. And I think that, you know, the one area where we do have some plans, it's just that they're not nearly adequate, is probably climate. I mean, that's where we're furthest along. But this technology revolution is, of all the three, the most important. And I just, you know, I look at the government's AI strategy, it has a strategy, but it's just nowhere near what's necessary. And there's not a sense to me that you're restructuring government in order to deal with it.
John,
John McTernan, former staff member and constant defender.
A brave man.
Not all change has to be confrontational. There's different models of change. I wonder whether it's worth reflecting on successes where we achieve change that's now consensual. So I watched the BBC documentary, and two things I was struck by. One was how young everybody looked, and the other was that in 1996, 97, there were hardly any women, even in the Shadow Cabinet and the Labour's Cabinet. And now the whole of politics it's almost 50-50, people of colour. And that's a change that was driven by Harriet Harman, by a whole movement of women like Harriet. And it was radical and transformatory, yet it wasn't confrontational, really. And are there things to learn from the changes we achieved and look back on them, and they've just become settled? Some of the changes in the NHS, just rather than always looking at the Thatcher confrontation, are there ways of managing difficult changes? Because I agree with you, we will be happier and we will be better off if we do this the right way.
Yeah, again, I think it's a very important point. I mean, the ambition should be to do it in a consensual way. I mean, part of my problem with the Thatcher Revolution is that you felt confrontation was part of the DNA of what was happening. But, you know, you think the minimum wage, which we did through the Low Pay Commission, and remember the 1992 general election, well, some people here won't remember that, but back in the day, it was opposition to the minimum wage was a major plank of the Conservative attack on Labour. And today it's consensual. Gay rights, obviously, very, very different now today. On the other hand, I think some of these changes are going to be very far-reaching, and I do worry that whether we want to make them confrontational, others will. I mean, I think this climate thing, which is completely the right ambition and is doable, but when you look at the facts of the scale of the transition, I don't think people are not prepared for this at all, and I can see a big populist backlash against that, with people saying, look, you can't even be sure that the main emitters in the world are going to take the action, and you're asking us to take these big changes with no guarantee that we really can make any difference to the problem. So I think yes, we should try and make change in a consensual way. I think there are ways of doing it. That's why it's easier if you bring people together across party lines. And, you know, one of the things that became really bad about our politics was people thinking there was something intrinsically unprincipled about people in different parties working together. Whereas if I'm right and the problems are essentially practical, it's sensible to get the best people and the best brains to work on it. That's why we hope in this May conference, you know, we will have people from the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, Lib Dems obviously, and people who aren't in any political party.
There's a question come from online. Duncan Rook asks, is a reconciliation between the UK and Europe inevitable? In what form and what are the preconditions? It's one perhaps where practicality, ideologies trumps practicality.
Yeah, inevitable's maybe too strong, but I think it's obvious. And look, we can't, you know, as I said in the speech, we can't change our geography, and we can't change our interests. So I think the first step is to get a proper trade agreement with Europe. The second is to specify the areas where we want to cooperate, which I think would be very sensible across areas like defense, energy, environment, as I say, maybe technology as well. I'm not sure. There may be areas we want to diverge in regulatory terms and technology, but there may be many areas that it suits our technology sector to align. So that's the second step. And the third step, I think, is to create a culture of cooperation and exchange, which means that even if we're not formally part of the European Union, at least where there are major decisions that affect us, there's a process of interaction. So, let me give you an example. When President Biden comes out with his global tax initiative, Europe responds to that. Now, this will affect Britain's interests in a big way. It would be sensible for us to at least be part of that European conversation. You don't need to be part of the European Union to be part of that. So I would be looking for ways of establishing a good and strong relationship with Europe. I mean, it's for another generation to decide what happens in the future, I think. But even if you're pro-Brexit, you're surely not against having a good working relationship with your nearest neighbours. And you know, as I sometimes say to people, you can get to Paris by train quicker than you can get to Edinburgh or even Newcastle.
So would you want to rejoin? Do you think that battle is lost from your point of view? Or do you think that should be a longer term, medium term campaign?
I think it's not for the moment, and who knows what will happen in the future. But I think it would be a political error to revive the whole argument. It's just got to accept that, no matter how passionately opposed to it I was. But I think the thing to focus on, because I think you will get majority support for this very clearly, is you need a relationship, and let's make it a practical one. Let's make it work for us and for them. And you know, you don't want a situation where your prime minister's not on good terms with European leaders. It's just, there's too much that, you know, in the end, Russia, Ukraine, right? It's another example. I mean, there's too much that you have to do together not to have a good working relationship.
There's a Peter Kyle question.
Thank you, Peter Kyle. The key challenges and opportunities you outlined, Europe and international relations and trade, climate change and technology, they all have a very big global element. Considering that you harnessed globalisation, you made globalisation, the first wave of it, work for Britain, but there was a backlash and there were consequences to it. If we are going to enter another era of globalisation and global relations are the solution to some of these big challenges you outline, how do you learn the lessons of the first wave that you steered for our country and avoid some of the backlash that has led to some of the really difficult things that you're being challenged on now?
Yeah, well, that's a very fair point. You see, for me, globalization it's not, in the end, a government policy. It's something that is happening as a result of change in the world. Right? Changes in technology, which bring us closer together, the internet and so on, changes in migration, changes in travel. And I think there is a backlash against globalization. I mean, Brexit was an example of that to a degree. But in the end, you're not going to stop this process of people interacting and coming together. I think what we do have to do, though, is it looked like, it never was, by the way, for me, but it looked like globalization had become part of our ideology, right? Whereas actually the reasons are all enlightened self-interest, not because you want globalization for the sake of it. It was a recognition that it was a process that was happening, and how do you make sense of it? And I think, again, COVID is quite instructive, because the absence of global cooperation on COVID has been shocking. I mean, absolutely shocking. At the very beginning, we should have, for example, decided that we needed to produce the vaccines fast, to do the clinical trials really fast. There's no point in all the major countries doing it all differently. They should have agreed how they, for example, repurposed manufacturing capacity so that you produce much more vaccine. I think I'm right in saying that only 25% of global capacity for manufacturing was actually used for COVID. I think there's only one example I can think of, which is the Merck plant in the United States that was repurposed for the COVID vaccines. I mean, nuts. We should have been doing all this together. Testing. I think if you'd established right at the outset, just in financial terms, a tiny amount of money, let's say you got $10, $20 billion. Again, Sir Ronald Cohen here put forward an idea which I took to the government, but again, it didn't happen, that you set up literally a fund and you just back the most innovative things that you can find on testing. I'm sure we would have got further along much faster. And then, of course, it's been obvious from the beginning that if you don't vaccinate the world, you've got a problem in your own country. And so all of this vaccination argument has proceeded as if it's an aid argument, whereas it's not an aid argument, it's a self-interest argument. So again, now there is vaccine flowing to the developing world now, but now the problem is the absence of ability to absorb it and to get it from the port and the warehouse into people's arms. But all of this should have been organized. And I believe in a time gone by would have been organized. Britain would have had a close relationship with America. We'd have mobilized the G7. We'd have gone along in a united way to the G20 and said, this is what we're going to do. And we would have said to the Chinese, whatever else our disagreements are, on certain things in relation to this, we should work together. And I find it, so the thing with globalization is, in the end, it's important for people to understand that it's a practical thing, ultimately, and you make use of it. If it wasn't for the cheap goods being made abroad, by the way, inflation would have been a much bigger problem. You've got to also explain this to people. And I'm afraid it all became really, it's all become associated with the immigration problem and more or less sort of demonized as a result of that. But it's, again, if we had imaginative leadership and the right relationships, I mean, this is one of the things that worries me about Britain today. We don't have a relationship with Europe. Institutionally, we've got a strong relationship with America, but I don't think politically we've got a strong relationship at all.
Do you wish you were back in government?
I don't think that's possible, and probably it's better that I'm doing what I'm doing.
Thank you very much, Tony Blair. Thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to everyone watching online.
Thank you.